Welcome to summary video number 1 in this Biblical Basics of Political Theology. I'm going to do a series of summary videos throughout this larger class, and the logic behind the summary videos is that we want to thread together some of the topics that have been covered before we go too far and drop some of those individual themes by the wayside. We want to keep them together. I've got a little bit of a teaser up on the screen. Coming up, I want to let you see what was helpful for me as I was working through this a couple years ago. Some illustrations of human rights and spheres. And so you can see up on the screen a fairly complex sphere there. We've got a family. And so I'm going to get to that, I think, in the next video. But for now, just wanted to give you a little bit of a teaser, and now we'll cut that out. But again, this is summary number 1. And as I said in the first video, this is kind of like mathematics. You have to learn addition and subtraction before you move on to algebra. And once you learn some of those basics, then you get these acronyms, PEMDAS, you might remember, parentheses and exponents and multiplication and division, addition, subtraction. We've learned addition, subtraction. We haven't gotten to multiplication yet. Nevertheless, I do want to summarize what we've covered so far. Now, math might be a good illustration, but I think a better illustration of political theology is that of a symphony. A symphony, right, is a collaboration of several different components working together. These distinct components, the strings and the brass and the woodwinds, and they're all, harmoniously producing something pleasing to the ear. If you get it wrong, as you think about political theology, if you get any of your pieces wrong, you end up way out in left field, like the Amish, who think they're supposed to be totally disconnected from the world. So we got to work piece by piece and then put everything together. And so this summary, if we think about what's been covered in lessons 1 through 5 so far, we've established that God has rights. His rights are intrinsic to his person. He has the right to be obeyed, the right to be represented by his image bearers, the right to be loved and worshiped. We probably could have added in the right to be believed, right? Faith is a central component. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so that we could have added that in, but I just chose representation, obedience, love and worship, right? We're talking about the affections and the ascriptions of greatness. And so God's intrinsic rights produce in man obligations, right? Obligations to obey, to love, to worship, and to represent. And those obligations in man produce man's rights. Man has a right to worship. He has the right to obey because he's obligated to. And so that produces a whole collection of human rights, we call them. We have the right to life, and that would include the means of life, the fruit of your labors. You're not entitled to food if he who does not work, is not to eat, or if he's not willing to work, he's not to eat. But the fruits of your labors. And so the means of life. There's the right to marriage, the right to family and children, and ordered liberty to carry out the mandate, however you want to title it. There's the right to worship, the right to education. And so this has some important implications. So, just simply, if we have the right to worship, then another sphere can't come along and tell us that we can't gather, right? Or we can't sing. If we have the right to education, then another sphere can't come along and say, oh, no, you must teach your children perverse sexuality, or you can't teach your children the truth. No other sphere can infringe in that way. And those rights then correspond to spheres. And this is where things get a little more difficult. There's the sphere of self and the sphere of family. Education is a sphere. Society is a sphere. I think it's fair to call the state a sphere. There's the arts and the sciences. So there's a whole host of spheres. And we've summarized that God delegates limited authority to a person in a sphere with purpose and limitations, right? So Adam and Eve fill the earth. They have the power to do that. They have the power to eat from the tree, but that's off limits, right? So they have authority and power, two separate things. We always have more power than we do authority. Every time we sin, we're using our power in a way we're unauthorized to do. And then we talk about the fall. There's now post-fall institutions. They did not exist pre-fall, right? There's a redemptive institution or a redemptive sphere, we might say, the assembling of the people of God. And then there's the retributive sphere. There was no need for that pre-fall. So now the state, sometimes we call it, the state executes wrath, right? Romans 13. This higher authority is God's avenger, retribution, and that exists post-fall. Neither one of those existed pre-fall because there was no need. We've introduced the speculation that we probably would have had nations had the fall not occurred, as people spread out, as they would have developed some unique kind of languages, unique customs and cultures based upon, geography, things of that nature. We probably would have ultimately ended up with distinct nations and even dialects. There probably would have been governments over those individual nations. And part of the reason we argue that is not only just kind of the logical outworking of Genesis, but what we see in Revelation 22 is that there are kings and nations. And so kings and nations can't merely be a product of the fall because they continue in glory. It's not something that needs to be eradicated as an effect of the fall. And so these kings and nations continue. We're going to be a part of a nation and we'll have kings in the eternal state. It's not bad. We talked about 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13. Both make it clear that the state is a retributive institution. It's the scope of their authority is actually pretty clearly defined in both 1 Peter 2 and Romans 13. Pushing a little bit further, we saw that Genesis 3 gives us the divine paradigm for retribution, or we might call it the divine paradigm for adjudicating crimes. And so God gave us the template. He is the king. He's the lawgiver. He gave Adam and Eve the law. There was a human rights or a divine rights, rather, violation, right? God's rights were violated. He wasn't obeyed. And so on the basis of that, he then initiated an investigation. And so on the basis of this investigation, he came and he examined Adam and Eve, and that elicited a confession. And that confession then resulted in God sitting as the judge, right? After the investigation is completed, now he functions judicially. He declares their guilt. And so there's a declaration of guilt followed by a sentencing. They're declared to be or sentenced to be kicked out of the garden, and then he executes punishment. And so we see in Romans 13 that the state as a retributive institution collects taxes. Paul makes that very clear. For this reason, you pay taxes, because as a retributive institution who functions under that divine paradigm in Genesis 3, we need a legislative body to publish the laws. Right? They need to punish evildoers, which means they have to publish what evil is. And obviously that brings in some issues. How do we define evil? Who defines evil? And what is the scope of evil that is to be punished, right? So we're talking about first table, second table issues, but God defines evil. We don't define evil. And so we publish God's existing standard. That's what the state does. And so we pay taxes so that the state can publish the law. And then after publishing the law, if there's a rights violation, particularly human to human, first and foremost, a rights violation, private property, assault, things of that nature, then there has to be an investigation. Has this happened? And so you need an investigative arm, and then you're going to need a judicial arm to weigh the evidence, and a judge and a jury to decide is somebody guilty. And so the judge would make that declaration. And then you need another arm to carry out the sentencing. So we pay taxes so that there can be a legislative body, an investigative body, a judicial body, some sort of sentencing or execution body. And so that's all the scope then, properly speaking, biblically, of the state. It's proper to pay taxes, right? So we are not those, as Christians, we're not those who say taxation is theft. We are not those who say, government is a necessary evil. Government's a good thing. It's a divine institution. The state, the magistrate, is actually God's servant, God's minister. And so we would say, hey, every servant should acknowledge his master. And that's kind of the idea here. And so that's what we've covered so far. Now, that does bring up a couple issues that I've not been able to cover, and I really don't plan on covering in any detail. I've probably done an hour-long sermon on every one of these issues. Every one of these first 5 videos have had at least one, if not 2 or 3 sermons, and so there's plenty of material to dig deeper if you want. But just to just acknowledge some of the issues. One of the issues is the continuity or discontinuity of the mandate. And there's different names, right, for this, really this mandate. Sometimes the names focus on different aspects of it. I really like what I learned in seminary from Dr. Michael Vlock. He calls it the kingdom mandate, right? To rule and subdue. That's what man was tasked to do, to rule and subdue. It's repeated in Psalm 8. It's still binding on us today. But sometimes I also call it the cultural mandate, because we're supposed to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And fill the earth includes people, but I think it also includes culture. And the reason I believe that is because the next time the word fill is found is in Genesis 6, and the earth is said to be filled with violence. And so there's the kingdom mandate. We can call it the cultural mandate. We can call it the creation mandate. We can call it the dominion mandate, whatever you want to call it. There is some disagreement about the degree of continuity or discontinuity. But I think we need to note that Genesis 4 records Cain's line carrying out the mandate. And again, it is repeated in Psalm 8, but there is some disagreement there. And where you land is going to have impact in your political theology. It is speculative whether or not nations would have developed apart from the fall. I think the case is pretty clear that they would have. Another issue is, when did the state begin? When did civil government actually begin? And this brings even an issue of definitions and the importance of concise, clear language. So I really don't like the word government as a synonym for the state. And the reason being, I like to define government as the exercise of divinely delegated authority. And when we define government that way, then it actually makes more sense, because we have church government, right? We talk about a church government, and that's the exercise of divinely delegated authority in that sphere. There's family government, or the government of the home, right? Again, that exercise of divinely delegated authority. But the question is, when did the state, as a sword-bearing institution, when did it begin? And, a lot of people would argue for Genesis 9. I think that's got a lot of problems. We'll deal with it later. But we don't exactly know when the state began. And maybe I'll just say now why I don't think it's Genesis 9. Well, because right off the bat, there wouldn't have been a civil government. If one of Noah's kids or his grandkids had committed murder, it would have been the family executing the other family member. So it wouldn't have been the civil government as we understand it. And so to me, that's really the biggest issue, is that within, say, 100 years of Noah receiving the command for the death penalty, there wouldn't have been a civil government as we think of it. So anyway, we can come back to that. One other particular issue is, if we're going to have this retributive institution, which we do, we call it the state, magistrate, Caesar, whatever. We have to ask the question, what is the standard that the state is to use for legislation? And historically, there have been kind of 2 camps, right? There's the natural law camp, and then there's the special revelation camp. And that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but that's the reality. One group of brothers would say, hey, we need to call the government to govern from natural law. And then there's a more recent development in which those who take that argument would deviate from the historical understanding of natural law, and they would say it's only includes the second table. I think, let me just tell you now, I think that's I don't think that's proper. I think it's a defective view, and here's the reason why. Genesis 9, the institution of the death penalty, is special revelation. Man would not have known that God requires the death penalty for murder were it not for special revelation. And so I don't think natural law is sufficient. But this is a big issue, and so this is just a few of the issues that I want to acknowledge. It might have come up in your mind as we've covered covered these very short 5 lessons. So next, I'm going to pick up on illustrating human rights. I gave you the teaser picture earlier. Then we're going to talk about what I think are the two main views of civil government. There's really statism and there's sphere sovereignty. I got a lot more to come, and so let me end this one, and then we'll move on to lesson number 6. Hope that's been helpful.